Good evening. We want to start. Thank you, Helen, for reminding me, asking everyone to please silence your cell phone. For those of you at home, you're welcome to keep it on. It's a great honor to welcome you all to our Young Israel West Hartford, both those joining us in person and those joining us virtually on Zoom for this fourth annual Margot Jeremias Memorial Kristallnacht Commemoration Lecture. It's a pleasure to welcome the extended Loew and Jeremias family, our evening sponsors and partners in this annual tribute, to welcome our co-sponsors, the Connecticut Voices of Hope and Jewish Federation of Greater Hartford, and our partners, National Council of Young Israels. And of course, our keynote speaker, my teacher and mentor, Rabbi Dr. Jacob J. Schacter. It's been a busy 24 hours at the Young Israel West Hartford. Last night, we kicked off our Wiesel door-to-door family learning program with almost 100 children. This morning, an army of volunteers packed and assembled some 300 bags for Jewish Family Services to provide for Thanksgiving, and tonight's, of course, Kristallnacht lecture. All programs that I think would have made Mrs. Jeremias proud, and I'm pretty sure she would have been at all three of them. I'd like to thank many people who helped put this together, and in particular, Eric Maurer, our very competent technological expert and guru. In a moment, I will invite Helen and Rabbi Daniel Loew to introduce the evening and our speaker more formally, but I'd like to just steal a moment to express my personal thanks and communal gratitude to Rabbi Schacter for everything that he has done and continues to do to support our Young Israel and the West Hartford community. Beyond a scholar and a renowned speaker, Rabbi Schacter is a rabbi's rabbi, a mentor to so many rabbis across the globe, myself included, and I am privileged to call myself one of his students. In the spirit of the Talmudic story, which brings a surprise Moses into the classroom of Rabbi Akiva, expounding the teachings of Moses, tonight's evening and the precious relationship that it commemorates for me was long foretold by Rabbi Schacter. More than a decade ago, I was sitting in a first-year survey class at Yeshiva University's rabbinical school, and Rabbi Schacter shared with us the opportunity, the experience of what the real-life pulpit is like. And he described the beautiful opportunity to forge incredible and meaningful relationships with those across generations, and how those relationships undoubtedly would be precious to those who we formed them with, but would in turn transform, enhance, and profoundly embed itself on us, on the rabbis, as people and professionals. I think I understood the words intellectually at the time, but it was only many years later that I would come to appreciate their simple truth, the profundity of what they said, and their prophet-like character. I will always cherish the years we were blessed to know Mrs. Jeremias. From our everyday visits and words of wisdom and clarity to extraordinary examples of courage and fortitude amidst political uncertainty, through everyday moments and the special sweet moments of my life, like bringing our daughter to meet Mrs. Jeremias and receive a bracha from her. They are forever imprinted upon me and my family, and they continue to be a source of inspiration and strength every day, but especially in these tumultuous times we've been living through. So thank you, Rabbi Schacter. It is my pleasure to call upon Helen and her son, Rabbi Daniel Loew, to continue our program.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming. Les and I are proud to sponsor the fourth annual lecture in memory of my mother, Margot Jeremias, and we welcome those who are here in person and those joining us on Zoom. Kristallnacht was a pivotal event in my mom's life. On November 9th to 10th, 1938, Nazis in Germany set synagogues on fire, made bonfires of Torahs and Jewish books, arrested Jewish men, and killed close to 100 Jews. I picture my mother, 12 years old at the time, going to school by train as she could no longer attend school locally. On her way, she heard the sound of broken glass and people shouting, "Down with the Jews, kill the Jews." She was advised to return home, and terrified, she waited for the next train back for 2 hours. Once home, she witnessed the Nazis setting a bonfire in a field near the shul where they burned the Sifrei Torah. Her father and other men were arrested, and her dad did not return for 5 weeks, released only because he was a veteran and hero of World War I. She lived in constant fear, unable to sleep or eat. Of course, events escalated after that fateful day, and my grandparents were ultimately killed in Auschwitz. My mother first started speaking publicly about her experiences when our son Daniel was in 4th grade, asked by one of his teachers to share her story. School-age kids remained her favorite audience throughout her public speaking career. It was never easy for her to talk about these past events, but she was determined to share her eyewitness testimony. She was justifiably proud of the life she built with my father and of her family, including 2 daughters, 7 grandchildren, and 18 great-grandchildren. She spoke of the need to be vigilant but hopeful, tolerant and kind. Certainly, this is a timely message. She would not be shocked by the rise of anti-Semitism today, but worried and concerned. Much thanks to Kathy Fishman and Voices of Hope, who have graciously co-sponsored this lecture. My mom would be pleased that they are continuing their mission of education. As always, Les and I are grateful to Rabbi Brander, who worked so hard on putting together and advertising this program. His vision has inspired all of us. He had a special relationship with my mother, and they greatly appreciated one another. We are thrilled to have Rabbi Jacob J. Schacter as our speaker this year. A renowned lecturer on Jewish thought, we know he will share valuable insights with us this evening. Our son, Rabbi Daniel Loew, will now introduce Rabbi Schacter.
Thank you, Mom. It's a privilege to be here back in West Hartford to honor the legacy of my grandmother. In addition to being a Holocaust survivor, someone who had the courage to maintain her faith through the horrors of the camps and in a Christian convent, someone who rebuilt her life in a new country, and someone who spoke about her experiences educating thousands, she was also my grandma. And I am so fortunate that while I was living here in West Hartford with my family, she moved here and developed such a close relationship with my children. How incredible is it to go to your great-grandmother's house for a sleepover? She was a role model for 3 generations in our family, and we miss her greatly. It is now my honor to introduce Rabbi Schacter, whom I first met about 25 years ago. Rabbi Dr. Jacob J. Schacter is university professor of Jewish history and Jewish thought, and senior scholar at the Center for the Jewish Future at Yeshiva University. From 2000 to 2005, Rabbi Schacter served as dean of the Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik Institute in Boston, after serving as rabbi at the Young Israel of Sharon, Massachusetts, and at the Jewish Center in New York City. Rabbi Schacter holds a PhD in Near Eastern languages from Harvard University and received rabbinic ordination from Sifta Torah V'das. He is a member of the Board of Governors of the Orthodox Union and is on the editorial boards of Tradition, Jewish Action, B'chol D'Rachacha Da'ehu, and Jewish Educational Leadership. A prolific writer, Rabbi Schacter is presently completing a new Hebrew edition of the autobiography of Rabbi Yaakov Emden. In addition to all the above, which I summarized from the longer bio that was included in the publicity for this evening, as Rabbi Brander mentioned, Rabbi Schacter is a rabbi's rabbi. He is a mentor to many pulpit rabbis throughout the country and the world, supporting them with a unique combination of scholarship and warmth, intellectual rigor, compassion, and encouragement. I am fortunate to have numerous personal connections with Rabbi Schacter. He was friendly with my in-laws growing up. When I was in college, I worked with his daughter Leah in NCSY, and now his grandson Yonah and my son Avi are chavrusas at Yeshivat Sha'alvim in Israel. Rabbi Schacter is a dynamic and edifying speaker, and we are fortunate to have him with us tonight to honor the memory of my grandmother. Rabbi Schacter.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rabbi Brander. Thank you, Rabbi Loew. It's very special for me to be here this evening, to be with you. Thank you. And to be able to share some words in memory of Mrs. Jeremias. In the number of conversations that I had with Rabbi Brander leading up to this evening, I was totally struck by the passion, respect, and admiration that he expressed to me about Mrs. Jeremias. And it was remarkable to me how a woman who was older could arouse such admiration in a rabbi who was younger. And listening to Daniel and listening to you before, Daniel's mom, it's actually overwhelming how someone who could have gone through what she went through, who did go through what she went through, and who came to this country and built a life, was able to create and sustain and nurture an extraordinary family and extraordinary relationships. And so it's particularly meaningful to me to have my name linked with hers and to be able to share some thoughts in her honor and in her memory. It's a great privilege for me to stand at this pulpit that has been graced now with such exceptional distinction by my beloved friend, Rabbi Brander, for already a number of years. I know Rabbi Brander for a very, very long time, and I followed his career. And I know, by virtue of the fact that we've had many, many conversations about the level of commitment and interest and caring that he has for this community, for you, and for this congregation. I'm sure that by now you know how blessed you are. You probably know, but I want to tell you that Rabbi Brander is one of the most highly regarded young rabbis in our community. And hold on to him. I don't know what to tell you. You do what you need to do, because you are blessed. You're mamish blessed with greatness. There aren't, on one hand, that I could count rabbis like your rabbi. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Rabbi Brander, should give you the koach and the wisdom, continue your shefa brachos for this community. I've been following this community, bursting and bursting. Rabbi Brander shared with me plans for, this is like nowhere near enough for the people who want to come to shul. And that's extraordinary. It's extraordinary for incredible lay leadership that must be very much involved here, and also for the rabbi. I wish all of you well. It's a real privilege to be here. Rabbi there, because he wants them to understand. The recording is, should I start again, or we're going to assume? We're good? Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome. If you ask me afterwards, I'll be happy to review how we got up to this point. But I do want to say, for those of you who haven't heard, what a privilege it is for me to be standing in the pulpit that Rabbi Brander occupies, and to be here for commemorating the incredible, larger-than-life personality of Mrs. Jeremias. In this cemetery in Har Herzl, the military cemetery is divided by wars. There's a section for 1948, there's a section for 1956, 1967, the Lebanon War, all the way up to what happened not very long ago in Gaza. And he wants them to understand what it means to make the ultimate sacrifice on behalf of the Jewish people in the state of Israel. And he comes in and he takes them to the 1948 section. And within the 1948 section, and I urge you to check it out the next time you're there, there's one little subsection of 72 graves of soldiers who were killed fighting for what is known as the Kastel. You've all seen the Kastel if you've ever been on the road leaving Yerushalayim. So you curve and you curve and you curve and you curve and you're going down, and then it straightens out. And then up on the left, there's a little building. That building is the Kastel. During the 1948 war, that was the only road. Today, it's a wide road. Baruch Hashem, there was one lane in each direction. It was the only road leading to and from Jerusalem. It was surrounded totally by the Arabs. And obviously, control of that road was centrally crucial, because if the Israelis lost control of that road, then Jerusalem would have been strangled. So there's a huge battle for the Kastel. 72 boys are killed, and they're all buried together. He comes to the section, he tells them the story. And if you've ever been to the cemetery, you will know that every single gravestone looks exactly the same. The name of the soldier, the name of the parents of the soldier, the serial number, and the rank, and the day the soldier was killed. Whatever the rank is, it doesn't matter. They all look exactly the same. So after he tells them the story of the Kastel, they start walking around and they turn a bend and they look down, and there is a grave that says Almoni. The name on the grave is Almoni, with the date that Almoni was killed. Almoni means, in America, we would say John Doe, anonymous. We don't know who he is. Almoni, everybody else has a name, Almoni. I was there not very long ago, and I found Almoni. It's right there, turn the corner, in the corner is Almoni. And Uriel tells us that his young guys are looking around, they come across Almoni, and they say, Maze Almoni? Lo yadu et Hashem shelo. Lo yadu et Hashem shelo. Nobody knew his name? They had to put Almoni? They couldn't figure it out. So Uriel tells us that he explains to them that, you see, this Almoni lost everybody during the Shoah. This Almoni lost his parents, his grandparents, his uncles, his aunts, his siblings, his cousins, everybody, and he crawled here after the Shoah, and he ended up on the shore of Atlit, or the shore of Haifa, in 1948, and as soon as he landed, they gave him a gun and they said, we need you to go fight. There's a war going on. We need all the help we can get. I don't know if you know, there were 600,000 Jews who were living in Israel when the state of Israel was founded. 150,000, 25%, were Holocaust survivors. We need everybody. So they give Almoni a gun, and here's the trigger, and here's a bullet, and here's where you put it in, and here's how you shoot. He goes off to fight, and he gets killed. And the only ones who knew his name were his friends who were killed together with him. Nobody knew his name. He tells us that the Chevra were just totally flabbergasted. They were deep in thought. They start to say, Mi magia lapo, mi magid kaddish bishvilo, mi omer kelmo lerachamim bishvilo. Whoever looks at this guy, whoever comes here, whoever visits him. We know the date he was killed. It was Almoni, and the date he was killed. Who says kaddish for him? And that was the end of that session. They were totally overwhelmed by this. And everybody leaves and goes home. A week later, Uriel tells us he gets a phone call. Uriel, matzanu et hamishpacha shelo. Matzanu et hamishpacha shelo. Uriel says, atem mishugayim? איך זה יכול להיות? מה זה, מצאתם את המשפחה? זה אי אפשר. אוריאל, מצאנו את המשפחה שלו, אנחנו המשפחה שלו. We found his family. You know who his family is? We are his family. We are his family. We are his family. And he told us that every year, you know, that when Israeli soldiers finish the army, they're out of here. They are done. They leave. They go to the Alps, and they go to Nepal, and they go to Machu Picchu, and they go to Capri. They go to Eckveld at the end of New Zealand. They're done. They're out every single year. On the yahrzeit of Almoni, a minion of Chevra show up, and they say Kaddish for Almoni, and they thank him for making the ultimate sacrifice and for giving up his life so that they and we can be free and strong. What brings me here tonight and why Kristallnacht commemoration is so important, and why Shoah commemoration is so important, and why it's remarkable that a woman like Mrs. Jeremias, who went through what she went through, and we heard a little bit about it before, a little bit. If you do any research in Kristallnacht, it was horrifying. The stores and the shuls and the burning and the shattered and the killing. There was some 500 suicides of people who just gave up. It was a horrific disaster. 12 years old. And to go through that and to somehow keep her humanity intact and to create a family, l'shemu l'seferis. This is important because we're all one family. And it's important for all of us to remember and all of us to do whatever we can to try to make this world a better place. I want to shift the focus from the beginning of the Shoah to the end of the Shoah. The beginning of the Shoah is actually debatable. Some say maybe it was the Nuremberg laws in 1935, maybe it was Kristallnacht, maybe it was September 1st, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland. We don't know exactly. But we know it ended in 1945. And what I'd like to do is to share with you a little bit about the story of my own father, Rabbi Herschel Schacter, who was the first American Army chaplain to enter into the concentration camps. He liberated the concentration camp of Buchenwald, which was near Weimar in Germany, on April 11th, 1945. And I want to share a little bit about his experience because I want to frame the story of the Shoah in the bookends of the beginning and the end. My father was born in 1917 in Brooklyn, New York, to Galiciana parents. His father, Reb Pinchas, was known as Reb Pinchas Shoichet. He was the 7th generation Ben Achar Ben of Shochtim, of ritual slaughterers. Our name is Schacter. Schacter comes from the fact that we were Shochtim. 7 generations, my father broke the chain. My grandfather died when I was a year and a half. I don't remember him at all, but he was the last of the Shochtim in our family. My father went to local yeshivas, the youngest of 10 children. He lost 5 siblings before he was born. My grandparents buried 5 of their 10 children before they had 10 children. All different kinds of illnesses and sicknesses and diseases, the flu epidemic of 1917 and more, tetanus, all kinds of horrible stories. My father was a prodigy, and it's hard for me to believe, but he told me, and then was actually confirmed for me, that when he was 9 years old, he was a very gifted speaker. You're not going to believe this. They would take him and put him up on a chair under a chuppah so he could talk to the chassan and kala and give them a message under the chuppah about life and future and whatever you talk to a chassan and kala about under the chuppah. This 9-year-old little kid on a chair is declaiming messages for the chassan and kala. I didn't believe it for a second until I met a woman who told me that he did it for her under her chuppah, and I still couldn't believe it. He ended up in Yeshiva College. He graduated in 1938, and he entered rabbinical school at Yeshivas Rabbeinu Yitzchak Olchan. He studied with Rab Moshe Soloveitchik, who was the Rosh Yeshiva. But then at the end of 1940, beginning of 1941, Yeshiva College and the yeshiva suffered terrible losses. Dr. Bernard Revel, the president, died. Rav Moshe Soloveitchik, the Rosh Yeshiva, died within 2 or 3 months of one another. And there was no future. He hung around. 6 months later, Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik showed up. He became the Rosh Yeshiva. There was a backlog of guys. My father was the first one in to get smicha from Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik. For us and our family, this is a very, very special moment. Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, known as the Rav, the Rebbe of all of us, and the Rebbe of our Rabbeim, and the Rebbe of our rabbis, and the Rebbe of the Rabbeim of our rabbis, gave more smicha to anyone else in Jewish history. Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik has his name signed on some 2,500 rabbinic certificates, klaf. My father was the first one. And because of that, he had a very warm relationship with Rabbi Soloveitchik for the rest of his life. He gets a job in Stamford, Connecticut, in Agudas Shalom in Stamford, Connecticut. He gets a job as a rabbi, pending getting smicha. He was there part-time, and he had to get smicha. I told you he got smicha. He told me that it was with big rachmei shamayim, that Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik and the other two bochanim, examiners, was an oral exam that lasted 4 hours. And finally, Baruch Hashem, he got smicha. And he was able to be a full-time rabbi in Stamford, Connecticut. This past Wednesday night, I spoke in Agudas Shalom in Stamford, Connecticut. It was a real moment for me to stand. It's not in the same pulpit and it's not in the same place, but to be in the shul where my father started in 1941. He decided he wanted to volunteer to the army. Any rabbi, any clergyman is exempt from the draft, but he felt that he wanted to volunteer. His parents were absolutely and unalterably opposed to his volunteering. He was the youngest. You're doing already good work. You're helping Jews. Why do you have to go over there? You could help Jews in Stamford. You're teaching Torah. You're doing a chesed. You're a communal leader. But he felt that he had to go and to fight, A, on behalf of America, and B, to try to help Jews. There's a big debate about how much did American Jewry know in 1941 about what was unfolding already then in Europe, but they knew enough, and he felt that it was important for him to go. We have a letter that we discovered in his files after he died, explaining to his parents why he wanted to go. The letter was discovered by the author of a book. I brought this to show you about 3 months ago. A book was published called The Rabbi of Buchenwald, The Life and Times of Herschel Schacter. We commissioned Dr. Raphael Medoff to write a biography of our father, but not really a biography of him, but to try to understand how events unfolded in American history and in Israeli history and in world history through the prism of my father's biography. He was a very, very prominent American and internationally renowned leader. When he died in March of 2013, his obituary was on the front page of the New York Times. He was considered to be a prominent, and what got him on the front page of the New York Times was his experience in Buchenwald. He writes a letter to his parents, and it's a gripping letter explaining why he's contravening their wishes and he's going into the army. He goes into the army, spends some time in America, and then finally gets shipped overseas. He makes his way through the Battle of the Bulge, and in April, he's now in Germany, pushing against the retreating German army. On April 11th, he enters into the Buchenwald concentration camp. There are many stories, and there are many experiences that he had. The narrative of my childhood was meeting survivors whose lives he saved. I think at this point, I want to stop. I sent Rabbi Brander 2 video clips to show you. I think we'll stop now. We'll show the first one. You'll hear my father speaking. And I'm telling you that there are some really graphic, horrible pictures what he saw. We found these pictures in his files. I don't know who took them. What he saw when he came into Buchenwald. It's about 4 minutes, 4.5 minutes, I think. So this way you'll hear his voice, and then I'll continue thereafter.
The most unforgettable day in my life was April 11, 1945. It was on that day that, as a young American Army chaplain, I served with frontline troops across Europe, and then, precisely on that day, came upon the infamous, notorious Buchenwald concentration camp. I had heard nothing of Buchenwald until that day. It was only my sad experience to have seen, to have participated in the ravages of war, to have seen cities laid waste and homes destroyed and human beings crushed. But especially do I consider it a privilege, tragic and grievous though it was, to have come face to face with the stark, bitter, sordid reality of Jewish tragedy. As I mentioned a moment ago, I came upon this hellhole called Buchenwald within a matter of hours after the first columns of American tanks rolled through and liberated that dungeon on the face of this earth. I do indeed consider it a privilege, tragic, sad, to have been among those who literally opened the gates of hell, the crematoria. I saw hundreds of human bodies strewn in front of the ovens that were still hot, the smoke still curling upward, waiting to be shoveled into the furnaces. How can any human being ever forget such a sight? I stood there in front of those hot ovens, my eyes riveted to that view. I must tell you that whenever I even attempt to repeat this story, to relive that moment, it is exceedingly difficult to do so. I ran to seek out Jews, to find Jews who were still alive, and indeed there they were in a long series of low barracks. I ran into one after another, and there again, no matter what we have seen or heard, believe me, there simply are no words in the human vocabulary that can even remotely attempt to describe the horrors, the brutal, inhuman horrors that were perpetrated against our people. Within this huge Buchenwald camp, there was one area that was called Das kleine Lager, the small camp, that was reserved especially for the brutal treatment of Jews. I went into those barracks, and there I saw just raw planks of wood, shelves on which were strewn scraggly, stinking straw sacks. And there they were, looking down at me. Men, a few boys. There were no women in Buchenwald. But I will never forget those eyes, haunted with fear, half crazed, emaciated, more dead than alive. Spontaneously, intuitively, I felt the only language that I could speak that most of them would understand was Yiddish. And I called out, Shalom Aleichem, Yidden, ihr seid frei. You are free, the war is over. And there they were, looking out at me through incredulous eyes. But again, I can't continue. I could go on, but from that moment, I must tell you that my life changed. The impact of that experience was enormous on the whole course of my career.
We're good with that. One of the survivors that he met was Rabbi Les Loew, who became the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, and then the chief rabbi of Medinat Yisrael, back again, the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv. Rabbi Lau was a little boy. His name was Lulik. He was 8 years old. He was in Buchenwald with his older brother, Naftali. Naftali became the consul general of Israel in New York in the 80s. And he met my father for the first time in Buchenwald. My father discovered him under a pile of bodies. And as he was walking around, I heard this from both my father and from Rabbi Lau, the pile begins to move and the little boy comes out. My father was holding a gun. He didn't know what to expect. He saw this little boy and developed a relationship with him. Rabbi Lau published a memoir a number of years ago. It's called Out of the Depths. And he describes his experiences in Buchenwald. And I want to read a little piece of it where he talks about his having met my father. The chaplain of the US Third Army was Rabbi Herschel Schacter, who later became the chairman of the Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations. In full army uniform, Rabbi Schacter got down from his jeep and stood before the pile of bodies. Many of them were still bleeding. Suddenly, he thought he saw a pair of eyes, wide open and alive. He panicked, and with the soldier's instinct, he drew his pistol. Slowly, carefully, began to circle the pile of bodies. And then, and this I recall clearly, he bumped into me, a little boy staring at him from behind the mound of corpses, wide-eyed. His face revealed his astonishment in the midst of the killing field, and that sea of blood, suddenly a child appears. I didn't move, but he knew that no child in this place could be anything but Jewish. He holstered his pistol, grabbed me with both hands, caught me in a fatherly embrace, lifting me in his arms. In Yiddish with a heavy American accent, he asked me, "Wie alt bist du, mein Kind? How old are you?" I saw tears dripping from his eyes. Still through force of habit, I answered cautiously, "What difference does it make?" He explained to me that my father came in and the American soldiers came in just a few hours after the Nazis left. And for the last number of years that they were in Buchenwald, a uniform meant death, torture, horror. And now a uniform comes marching in and starts talking Yiddish. And then on the lapel, there's the Aseres Hadibros. The chaplains had that insignia on their lapel. They didn't know what to make of this. So he was nervous. And my father asked him who he was. "Lulik from Pietrikov," I replied. "Who's your family?" My father was a Rav in Pietrikov. "You're here all alone without your father?" "Without my father, without my mother, they were killed. But I have a brother. He's sick, he collapsed, he's lying here in the camp." Rabbi Schacter gained my full trust when he told me that he heard of my father. He also heard of my father's cousin, Rav Meir Shapiro of Lublin, who initiated the Daf Yomi program. Then the American rabbi took me by the hand, and together we made the rounds of the barracks. Eden, ihr seid frei. That was the title of his obituary on the front page of the New York Times. Jews, you are free. We entered some of them together, others he entered alone. I remember the people lying inside. We saw them with blank stares, without even the strength to get up from their bunks. These people were not among those who could run to the camp gate and shout hooray with the rest. "Jews, you are liberated," called out the American rabbi in Yiddish. The inmates gazed at him incredulous, as if to ask, "Who is this crazy Michiganer standing here in uniform screaming in Yiddish?" Indeed, it was a strange, surrealistic sight. The prisoners lay emaciated and prone on wooden planks, while before them stood Rabbi Herschel Schacter, upright and strong, a messenger of redemption. These Jews were like the dying embers plucked from the fire that the prophet Zechariah describes. After visiting all the bunkers, Rabbi Schacter helped me find Naftali. We went to the hospital where my brother was being treated for typhoid fever. "My name is Herschel Schacter," he said, introducing himself. "I'm the army rabbi for the division that liberated Buchenwald." He took out several cans of orange juice from his bag. They didn't have teeth. They couldn't chew anything. So he gave them oranges or orange juice. "I know who you are," he said. "I'm going to help you. Everything will be all right." He reassured Naftali and concluded with a mazel tov. "You've gone, me'avdas lacheres, from slavery to freedom." Naphtali names Rabbi Herschel Schacter as the first person to offer him relief after liberation and says the rabbi restored his confidence in himself and in humanity. That was the hardest job. The hardest job was not even to give them food, but to restore faith, to restore their faith. Ever since that time, Rabbi Loew and my father were very close friends. Rabbi Loew never lost an opportunity to express his akar satov, his gratitude to my father. And that relationship extended to me as well. After my father died, I brought my whole family to meet with Rabbi Loew. I wanted him to meet my father's great-grandchildren. And we developed a close relationship. Right before COVID, I was in Israel. And the directors of Yad Vashem asked me to come to Yad Vashem. If you go to Yad Vashem, and I'm assuming once again, many, if not most, if not all of you have been to Yad Vashem. So next time you go on the way out, at the end of the war, it's about 3 rooms before the absolute end of the exhibit on the left-hand wall. There's a wall the size of this wall here with these 3 plaques centered all around from the floor to the ceiling of a picture of a service that my father ran in Buchenwald. It's on the cover of his book. Shortly after the war, this was in the Kinozala, where the Nazis gathered to watch movies. So he commandeered the space and he had a davening for them. And he described it with incredible intensity, that service. And he's up in front and he's trying to daven with them and he's trying to give them chizuk, and he says Kaddish with them. You can imagine what that Kaddish looked like. It's the first time they had a minyan. It's the first time they were able to say Hebrew words, Aramaic words, and they're standing in the place where the Nazis watch movies. And they're all yesomim, they're all bereft, they're lost, they have nothing. And he said it was a very, very intense tefillah. And in the front is Rabbi Loew. He points to himself as a little boy in the front. So they asked me to come to Yad Vashem to stand in front of the picture. And they invited Rabbi Loew to come to stand in front of the picture. And I pointed to my father and he pointed to himself. And then we looked at each other and we hugged one another. My only regret was that my father himself wasn't able to be there. He'd already passed away. But it was extremely moving. And for the second video, Yad Vashem put out a small snapshot of that experience. So I'm going to ask you now to turn to that video. It's about 1.5 minutes. I don't know if any of you were at the last APAC conference right before COVID at the end of February in 2020. Once again, Rabbi Loew and I shared the stage. We opened the APAC conference. It was really an electric moment for both of us. There were about 18,000 people there. And I went on and I spoke a little bit about my father, and then he came out and we stood next to one another. We were holding hands. And he is really an incredibly remarkable person. And is emblematic of what it means to be able to continue after having witnessed what it is that he witnessed as a little boy. Another survivor in Buchenwald, and there were many, was a fellow by the name of Martin Greenfield. So I don't know if you have ever heard of him. He's a very, very famous suit maker. And David Shalom might give you many brachas that you should be able to afford to buy a suit from Martin Greenfield. We're talking about a very substantial dent in our collective pocketbooks. He's a wonderful, wonderful person. He's a Greener, came from Buchenwald, went through Auschwitz, comes to the United States. He published a memoir appropriate for, I can't call him a tailor, but a measure of a man is the name of his book, From Auschwitz Survivor to President's Tailor. He had pictures in here in the book of every single president from Eisenhower on that he has provided suits for. And he told me, I became very friendly with him, that whenever he brought a suit to the White House, he'd slip into the pocket of the suit, "Be good to Israel." So that the president, when he puts his hand into his pocket, he should pull out, "Be good to Israel." It's a very, very, very fine, special person, very special. So he gave me his book, I'm reading his book, and I find things that I never knew. Martin Greenfield, Measure of a Man. On April 20th, 1945, Rabbi Herschel Schacter conducted the first Friday night service. That's the service that I was mentioning to you. There was singing, reciting of blessings, prayer, and much weeping. It was moving. The next day, Rabbi Schacter was mulling around outside the Czech barracks. In Yiddish, he said, "Nu se du a po Yidden du, was can reden Yiddish? Is there a Jew around here? Are there Jews who can speak Yiddish?" "I can," I said in Yiddish. "Thank you. Wie sind in die Yidden? Where are the Jews?" "This is the Czech barracks," I told him. "I'm one of the few Jews here. They let me stay here because I'm from Czechoslovakia." "Rabbi, I attended your service last night. It was very beautiful, but may I please ask you a question?" "Of course," he said. "Here's the question, capital T, capital Q. Rabbi, I must know, where was God?" If there is a question, that's the question. "Rabbi, where was God?" He lost everybody, Martin Greenfield, everybody. It's a young boy. And they're davening. My father told me that at that service, they're in the middle of davening, and a guy from the back screams out at the top of his lungs in the middle of the davening. And I'll say it in Yiddish because he said it in Yiddish, and I'll translate. "In welche Gott davens die? Zu der Gott, was hat reingeworfen dein Mama and Tate in crematorium?" Crematorium is the same word in Yiddish as in English. "To which God are you praying? Zu welche Gott davens die? To the God who threw your parents into the crematorium." He was beside himself, beside himself. What do? You're trying to run a davening, you're trying to give people chizuk, and this guy's screaming. My father told me he went over to him, he stopped, he went over to him, and he just held on to him, and he didn't say a word. What words are you going to say? He just held on to him. He was heaving, sobbing. I don't know how long it was, probably felt like 5 minutes, maybe it was a minute. Just held on to him, and he calmed down, and he calmed down, and he went back, and he continued the davening, and the man was quiet. I told my father many years later, when I began to think about this story that I must have heard 20 times, I said, to me, Tati, what's really amazing is that the guy showed up to the service. There were hundreds and hundreds of Jews who didn't come to the davening. There were many there, but there were hundreds who didn't come. He came. Something drew him to come. And that, to me, is the most significant part of this story, that he yelled out what he yelled out. How could you not yell that out? But that he came, he was part of the tzibur, and he yelled at God from inside the shul, not from outside the shul. I want to ask you a question, Rabbi, where was God? He stood still and silent. Look what happened, I pleaded. Where was God? There are no answers to certain questions, he said, staring off into the distance. This is a question for which there is no answer. I lowered my head and cried. Rabbi Schacter wrapped his arms around me and held me. That's not the end of the story. About 120 pages later, he tells about how he was a guest at the groundbreaking of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. in 1985. It's now 40 years later. He's already a chashuv hayit. He's a prominent member of the survivor community. He gets invited to the groundbreaking under President Reagan. My father was a guest speaker at this program. And he describes how he's sitting there in the group of people listening to the program. During the ceremony, an old rabbi got up to make some remarks. When I saw Martin, I said, you have to call him an old rabbi. He wasn't such an old rabbi. He was a rabbi, but you have to say old rabbi. During the ceremony, an old rabbi got up to make some remarks. His face looked familiar, but I couldn't place him. I know that rabbi from somewhere, I whispered to Arlene, his wife. The rabbi continued speaking. He explained that he witnessed the Nazi atrocities of the Holocaust firsthand as a chaplain in the US Third Army, which liberated Buchenwald. No way, I thought, it can't be him. And then, as if God himself were winking down at me, the rabbi told a story that I knew well. After the liberation, he recounted how a young boy asked him a question he could not answer: where was God? It's him, I said excitedly to Arlene. After the ceremony, I found the rabbi. Rabbi Schacter, my name is Martin Greenfield. I was at Buchenwald. I was a little boy who asked you the question. Rabbi Schacter told me he lived in the Bronx. We stayed in touch until his death in 2013. Every time we visited, no matter the occasion, we relived his story together. But standing there at the Holocaust Museum dedication, which turned into a Buchenwald reunion with tears streaming down our faces, all we could do was hold on to each other. I didn't want to let go of him. He didn't want to let go either. And now comes the part that really struck me. To experience once again that connection, to stand with the man who held me as a boy when my spirit had been shattered by the Nazis and their lust for death and darkness, I felt as though I'd been kissed by an angel. Wow, that's amazing. I felt as though I'd been kissed by an angel. On the one hand, this for me is extremely moving and inspiring. On the other hand, I've had a difficult time being the son of such a prominent human being who actually saves people's lives and who gives oranges to people who don't have teeth, and he brings them mamish, me'avdos lecheres, he's mamish mechaya mesa. And I think all of us, we wonder, like what difference can I make in this world? There are a lot of heroes around. There are some heroes around. I'm not a hero, but I think each one of us, and this is a takeaway, I think, for us, is that there are things that we could do to make other people feel like they're being touched by angels. Maybe it's not as dramatic. For sure, it's not as dramatic. But each one of us encounter situations where we extend ourselves, we give people a hug, we give people chizuk, and we never know. We never know the impact that we're going to have. And either then or later, they will realize that it's as if they were touched by an angel. I want to conclude with reflections on what brings us here and on the power of memory. The subtitle for the program this evening is Obligation to Remember. A quote: "When I stand before you here, judges of Israel, to lead the prosecution of Adolf Eichmann, I am not standing alone. With me are 6 accusers, but they cannot rise to their feet and point an accusing finger toward him who sits in the dock and cry, 'I accuse.' For their ashes are piled up on the hills of Auschwitz and the fields of Treblinka and are strewn in the forests of Poland. Their graves are scattered throughout the length and breadth of Europe. Their blood cries out, but their voice is not heard. Therefore, I will be their spokesman, and in their name, I will unfold this awesome indictment. So began the opening speech of the Honorable Gideon Hausner, the Attorney General of the State of Israel and the lead prosecutor in the case of Israel versus Adolf Eichmann on April 17th, 1961 in the city of Yerushalayim. And so I want to end this evening, more than 60 years later, in this incredible shul and community in West Hartford, Connecticut, on the blessed shores of this great country, the United States of America. We are gathered here tonight to speak for them, for those who cannot rise to their feet, for those whose voices cannot be heard, whose ashes are piled up on the hills of Auschwitz and the fields of Treblinka, whose ashes are strewn in the forests of Poland, and whose graves are scattered throughout the length and breadth of Europe. In their memory and in their name, we pronounce tonight the awesome obligation, Zachor, Gedenkt, remember. Why do we remember? Why is it important for us to remember? Memory is a fundamental concept of Judaism. The word Zachor, the verb Zachor, Zayin, Chaf, Resh, appears in its various times, in various forms in the Bible, no less than 169 times. Zayin, Chaf, Resh, Tanakh, 169 times. And on more than one occasion, the obligation, the injunction to remember actually takes the form of a mitzvah saseh. We have to remember the one that's relevant tonight, Zachor. You know the rest of the pasuk, Eis asher asa lecha Amalek, baderech b'tzeischa mitzrayim. Amalek is the paradigmatic representation of evil, of those who sought to destroy us, not only baderech b'tzeischa mitzrayim. We are obligated to remember the tragedies that we've experienced as a people for a number of reasons. And I want to share with you what I think, and I'd be interested to hear what you think. Number one, to teach us to be sensitive human beings, to treat those of us who are less fortunate. The Torah continues, V'zacharta ki eved hayisa be'eretz Mitzrayim, v'yiftacha Hashem Elokecha, al kein anochi mitzavcha es hadavar hazeh hayom. Remember when you were helpless. V'zacharta, Zayin Chaf Resh, you were an Eved once. And this will sensitize you to the helplessness of others, particularly solicitous to the Yasam and to the Almana. The Torah continues in a different pasuk, V'zacharta ki eved hayisa b'Mitzrayim. You were once an Eved. You were once discriminated against. You were once tortured. And therefore, I'm commanding you to be a mensch, to be different than they were. We know what it's like to be helpless. Remember that you were helpless, and that will sensitize you to the helplessness of others. Another reason to remember is to assure justice for the perpetrators. There are still not so many. Just recently in the news, there's a story about a perpetrator. Even some 75 years after the end of the war, there are still monsters alive in our midst who deserve punishment for their barbarism. And we can't allow them to enjoy the blessings of life that they so cruelly robbed from their victims. And I think the reason why we remember, getting a little bit closer to home, is to give honor and dignity to those who were killed, to those who cannot rise to their feet, whose voices cannot be heard, whose graves are scattered throughout the length and breadth of Europe. All we could do for them is to remember them, who they were, what they were like, their eyes and their smiles, and their hugs and their dreams, their stories, their suffering and their pain. And finally, the last reason is to give honor and dignity to Mrs. Jeremias and to survivors. To give honor and dignity to the survivors. I am in absolute awe of the survivors, absolute awe. witnesses to the utter depravity of humanity at its very worst. They are examples of the strength, fortitude, hope, and greatness of humanity at its very best. Exposed to the most malignant radiation of human cruelty, Mrs. Jeremias and other survivors emerged from their experiences not with fantasies of revenge, but with fantasies of respectability and decency. She and they responded to the total assault of death by an extraordinary, it's actually inexplicable, extraordinary outpouring of life. And so, in the memory of the Kedoshim and in honor of Mrs. Jeremias and other survivors, we mekayim the mitzvah saseh tonight, Zachor, Eis asher asa lecha Amalek. We pronounce the awesome obligation of Zachor, gedenkt, and remember. The beginning of the Shoah, the end of the Shoah, the aftermath of the Shoah, the horror and the blessing. Baruch Hu give us the koach to continue to do what we need to do in a world that is now becoming more and more challenging for Jews, to strengthen ourselves here in the United States, and to make sure that the state of Israel is strong and safe and secure, not only for those who live there, but for Jews all over the world. Thank you very much for coming. I very much appreciate it. I'm touched by your presence. I'm touched, Rabbi Brander, by the invitation to share some thoughts with you. And we should have simchas and nachas, and you should continue to have doiris, right? We're looking at 4 generations. That's amazing. Should continue to have nachas and good health from all the members of your family. Thank you so much and have a good evening. Are you joining me? Pleasure. I'm going to head down.
My name is Kathy Fishman, and I'm the Executive Director of Voices of Hope. Our mission is to promote a culture of courage to stand up against hatred through Holocaust and genocide education and remembrance. We are honored to be a part of tonight's program. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us tonight, in person and virtually. I'd also like to thank Rabbi Brander and Young Israel, the Federation, and Helen and Les Loew for sponsoring tonight's program and bringing it to our community. Margot had a significant impact on me, and we're really appreciative of this opportunity tonight. Thank you, Rabbi Schacter, for sharing with us why it is our obligation to remember and our responsibility to ensure events like Kristallnacht and the Holocaust never happen again. I hope you will join us this Wednesday night to learn more about Voices of Hope at our Evening of Hope, celebrating our 13th year. You can register at our website at www.ctvoicesofhope.org. Have a good night. Thank you for coming, and hope to see you again soon.